There it is. And also for people who's in mainland China right now, we are also streaming on Himalaya Live. If anybody, because this entire conversation will be in English, if anybody have trouble understanding, there will be live translation of summaries and bullet points for your reference in the chat box. And everybody, please feel free to use the chat box, because like my experience of Zoom for the past 2 months have proved that chat box has always been as fruitful as the conversation that's happening. So everybody, if you have any relative links, materials, questions, comments, please post in the chat box. And for those who have trouble accessing Zoom, if you're on YouTube or on Himalaya Live, you can use the WeChat group as well. And please post questions during and after our discussion. People like my colleague will summarize those questions, and we will ask during the last session of our panel. And if you want to speak up or tell us what you think, give us a heads up in the chat box during the Q&A, and we will unmute you. So yeah, without further ado, let me introduce our guest speakers today. First of all, it's Trương Wei. Do I pronounce that right?
Okay.
Okay. So he's a Vietnamese director, and his film has been selected for international film festivals such as Rotterdam and Busan. He is also one of the alumni of 2012 Asian Film Academy at Busan International Film Festival and 2016 Berlinale Talents. His latest film, The Treehouse, is a collaboration with a Chinese producer, Guo Xiaodong, and it's the only Asian project supported by Berlinale World Cinema Fund in 2016. The film itself is premiered at 72nd Locarno Film Festival. And we also have Haema Sivanesan. I don't know. Is that correct?
Okay, great.
Great. She is a curator at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. And she has worked in public galleries and art centers across Canada, Australia, and South Asia. Her curatorial work typically focuses on art from South and Southeast Asia and its diasporas, with an interest in non-Western, post-colonial, and transnational histories, worldviews, and practices. In 2018, she is a recipient of Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, New York, curatorial research fellowship, and her writing has been published widely in catalogs and art journals locally and internationally. Yeah, Wei and Haema, welcome to our conversation, and thank you for joining us. So the first part of our panel will be a presentation and talk about their own artwork, like the Treehouse, and also Imagining Busan, which is also another film with Scream, Parallel Narrative is part of Imagining Busan. So yeah, shall we start? Are you ready? Are you guys ready? Okay. Can you talk first and give Haema some time to wake up?
Okay, sure. Okay. First of all, thank you. Yeah, I think it's my first Zoom meeting. It's very weird.
Oh, really?
Yes.
You haven't done that for the past 2 months?
No. It's my first one technical meeting.
Well, I appreciate you coming here and take this challenge.
So I will try to be natural and to be there. I hope.
You are doing great.
Yes. Okay, so my name is Wei. Yeah, actually I'm living in Brussels now, not Paris. But anyway,
not Paris, but
yeah,
it's the same time zone, is it?
Yeah, the same time. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So yes, I just moved here. I think the end of last year from Le Fresnoy. It's the National Studio of Contemporary Arts in France. Mm-hmm. So for now, these 2 years in Europe, it will be kind of new experience for me when I try with new idea and new medium. And before that, I was living in Vietnam and made film there. So the Treehouse is my my latest film was shot in 2018. Yeah. And so that film could be considered as something like a combination of everything I want to say. So because so far before that film, I made several films, short and feature too, more or less about the same topic of harm and harmlessness in relating to personal memories, and of course with the historical background, something like that. But the Treehouse is can be considered like the first real documentary, which in the sense that there are real people out there, you know, and you reach them and tell their story through your films. So for the Treehouse, I collaborated, like you said, with Saudong. He's a Chinese producer. And we started the project in 2016, the very first idea. And so the very first idea of the film is based on the very blur image in my memory about a small lonely house somewhere on mountain somewhere in Vietnam, and by some reason the image of the house and the memory about that house still stay inside me. So I want to do something about that. But along the way, the film developed more and more concrete and less abstract. So when there are real people, their story is very concrete, and that's the point that I found the meeting bonds between my personal memory and their memories. And so the film is actually basically is a way to tell parallel different memories of different people who in reality don't know each other, something like that. Yeah. And the film, just like I just said, it's kind of continuation in terms of topic and approach to filmmaking for me. And before the Treehouse in 2000 what 2014 15, something like that. Yeah, I made a first feature film about my own family with my parents.
Oh.
So the first feature film is very personal, which I don't really feel comfortable in showing it because it shows too much about myself and the way I live and the way I growing up. And yeah, but it also the combination and the experiment of the fiction and the non-fictional elements in the first feature film, even is played by by my parents, yeah, and about their own stories. But there is a futuristic aspect, which is also appear in the Treehouse. Yeah, and so yes, I think I don't know what to say, but maybe I should go back a bit further to the beginning, like 10 years ago, when I started to think again about filmmaking, you know, because I quit from the film school in Vietnam, and then after that, I think everyone has this kind of moment when we start to question about a bit radically about what we want to do. And of course during that time it's not as easy as now to make film. Yeah, because now it's different with all of the cameras and the thing, and the way people see films now is different from before. I think like even just 10 years ago for me and for most of us, when we talk about film, it has to be something complete, you know, it has to be something expensive and something big. And that way of thinking also, how to say, limited me a lot. And it's kind of fear, you know, when you decided to make film and you have to buy a lot of money, mostly your own money, and which I didn't have money. So that's the point. And so the thing is, I I started to reflect about the way of making film, and then I realized that I should go back to my you can say I should go back to my roots, put in my hometown and my own memories. And then when I approach like that, I realized that I can use whoever around me, you know, to make film with me and about them. Like my first short film after that moment is about my father, basically, with him play himself. And of course, we always have the freedom to mess up things, you know, to put a lot of elements. It's not only about my father, it's also about a murder. They don't really link, but somehow they link. And I use a very small camera, the handy cameras. We only have 2-3 people, and basically we shot that film without any money. So slowly, and after that, I made several short film also with that approach, and I call itself like available cinema, you know. So you have basic skill and basic equipment, and then just you make film. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's enough, right?
Yeah. I wonder, you know, why, because you talk about like the, you know, camera, like equipment, and also budget. Did you film the treehouse in film? Like, is it 16 millimeter?
Yeah.
Film.
It's
How does that work?
Yeah, because the treehouse was shot in Super 16, which is expensive, and it's not only about budget; it's also about the freedom when you shoot. And
it's not very portable, is it?
Yeah, especially when it's a documentary, you know, you don't have script, you don't know location, you don't know what people will do. And normally if you use digital, especially now, it's cheaper and it's more practical, and everything you can shoot a lot and you don't need to care about what you have to use later. But for film, the most difficult to shoot a documentary in film for me is the interview, you know, because you always expect something from the interview, but you cannot ask people to say that, you know. And if they keep speaking, it's a nightmare, you know. You will burn film like that. But the thing is, why I didn't why did I choose film for this film for this the treehouse? Because after making several films with the very available cameras and technical equipment and very cheap, I started to feel that if I kept doing that, I will repeat myself, you know, because it's not only about the medium, it's about the way of thinking, you know, that the medium gives you. The freedom of the handy camera, it gives you different way of thinking than a limitation of a Super 60 millimeter camera. So the basic reason is just that I wanted to try something different, you know, and more challenging, and yeah. And like my producer, I think you know him, right? So no?
Yeah, well, through somebody else, but yeah.
Okay.
I think he never met him, but
he is a great guy, because when I proposed him the idea to shoot the film in Super 60 millimeter, he just tell me, okay, that's all. And
yeah, he did seem like very passionate about your project. So that's a very good thing for a producer.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
And you know, because from the information you gave me yesterday, and also I watched your film again this morning, I realized the different, you know, people and indigenous community in your film are, in fact, you know, geographically all over Vietnam. You know, they're from like highlands, you know, the southern part, the northern part, they're all over the place. So like, how did the traveling to different locations and landscapes was like, and how did you choose, you know, which part of the country you're going and which community you're approaching?
It's true that all of the characters in the film, they live from the north until the south of Vietnam, and Vietnam, which is very long, you know, more than 3,000 kilometers long. So like I just said that actually the original idea of the film is from the image in my memory about a house on mountains. So the very beginning of the film is just that to make something about that image. And then I just went to a mountainous area, you know, to look for a house that looked like in my memory. And basically and naturally, those area on mountains, the indigenous people, they live there. So yeah, it's naturally that they become the characters of the film. But the film cannot be random like that, you know. It cannot be random of like the camera just stop anywhere and choose somebody to shoot. So along the way, the film take a different structure and approach and idea, and I wanted to say something about home and homeless, you know. And then I read the newspapers here and there, and then I realized that there is a story about Wang is the man who used to live in forest for 40 years, and now he live also on the house like that on the mountains. And so here we can see that at the same time there are two layers. The first, the visual, which is also very coherent, the house on mountains, and on the background is the story about homelessness. And yeah, and then we have the story of the rook pupil by the Miss Ho. So her story and the part of her story is came at the end of the film, not at the end of the how to say the thinking about how to make the film, because so far it's all about house, about home, about homelessness, about childhood, you know. And then suddenly I realized the connection between the house and the mountain, you know, because the house itself and the mountain, because the mountain, which is the cave, you know, and then it brings the very further back primitive story about living in cave. And then by researching there, I knew that in Vietnam there is a group, a community, very small. They used to live in the cave, which some of them are still living now in the cave. Their name is Rook Pupil. And then I realized that that story will bring the very deep and very strong meaning to the whole film. The house will be not only a house anymore, but it's become a cave. And when we talk about the cave, it's the house for everyone, you know, basically for human beings, something like that. And then I went to the location of the Rook Pupil where they live, and it was not easy to approach there because they are control, you know. The local authority, they control the strangers from outside to enter the community. But by luck, I met her, and yeah, it happened. Yeah.
Perfect. And I'm also very curious about your sound design, because I know you work in collaboration with Ernst Carroll. Is that the name? Yeah. I noticed like he did a lot of work with the Harvard Sensory Ethnography Lab. Like for instance with Lucien Taylor with Leviathan, and also he has worked with one of my professors, Toby Lee. They did a lot of work together, and I think he has a very unique way of doing, you know, like sounds in ethnographic film. It just gives the like ethnographic documentary a very different texture. And in your film, you know, you talk about Mars and stuff, but you don't have like very futuristic visualization. But the sound, I think there is a futuristic element in there. And I wonder what that collaboration is like, and how did you guys come up with like ideas about sound?
Yeah. So I met Ernst, I think 4 years ago in Hanoi. So I participated in his workshop. It's very interesting 3-day workshop of listening and recording the sound, and then we hear the recording together. And yes, and after that, and it's very interesting that because Ern he came at the very right moment to help me to finish the film, you know, because after I have the editing, I have no budget left, but we still need to make the sound, and then for the premiere in the festival, which is only 1 month, in the next 1 month. So, and of course, to do this kind of sound, it takes a lot of time and also money. But then he just contacted me and he said that he can help me to do that, which is very great. And so we agree on one point that because in the film there are two different kind of sound. We can say the first and the most important is still a documentary sound, which is the sound of the real location of the interview, something like that. But there is more part of the futuristic sound about Mars or something like that, which is real also because it's not the artificial sound, it's a sound that recording on Mars from NASA. So
really?
Yeah. If you go to their library, you can, they have the audio library, you can see that, like the wind recording.
Wow, I didn't know that. Okay, that's like real. Oh, okay.
Or the launching of the launching, you know, sound when the metal crackling, opening and closing, something like that. I don't know why they record those kind of sounds, but it's very interesting.
Well, for documentaries.
So, yeah, so what we did is that we just meshed them together and make it longer or shorter, you know, speed up or slow down, something like that. Yeah, it's not our invention. It's up there, I think.
Wow. Wow, yeah. That's impressive. And I have another question. Well, I have another 2 questions. First of all, is the archival footage you used in the film about U.S. Army relocation program. I know that you found that on the Internet Archive. Can you tell us more about, you know, how did you come across those art footage and why did you decide to use them?
It's very how to say, it's a matter of luck and coincidence, you know. So I knew that I would like to use some footage, archival footage in the film at the beginning when the film didn't shoot yet. So I had time, and then I keep browsing on that website, Internet Archive. And so they have the very good way to search, like you will type your keyword and then you choose the year and the medium, like a film or image, something like that. So because the connection between people and the film is the word, you know, in the background. So the word that Bush, the Lang, and his father have to run to the forest 40 years ago, and the word that also have also make the people have to move from this cave to another cave, and it also the implication of Vietnam War and also something like that. So I know that one thing that I can try to use the war footage. And then I just type war, Vietnam War, something like that, Vietnamese war. And then it's appear a lot of footage shot by American military, obviously, very well preserved, you know. And then, but I cannot use it random footage like that, you know, because otherwise it will become too much random and too, I don't know how to say. But at one point, coincidentally, I came to a footage that was shot in Wang, you know, also that the soldier, they shot the scene when they push people, the villager go away and they burn their house, and because this location it's also the hometown of Lang, the character of the film. So there is the obvious connection of location, that in the same location in the past people also have to move away from their house, and now in the present time it also happened the same. And yeah, so that's the reason for me to use the footage. Yeah.
And where did you find the photography that you also included in the film? Also, like those blurred faces, and yeah.
You mean about the group of the people in the forest?
Yeah.
Is the I was very impressed the first time I saw that photo. I think very long time ago, like several years ago. Yeah, that's the newspaper, the article on BBC is about the people on the indigenous people on the Central Highlands have to run away from Vietnam, and then they through Cambodia, through the border, but they stuck in the forest between Cambodia and Vietnam, and they cannot go back to Vietnam, and they cannot go further. And so this is a photo of a Cambodian photographer. Yeah, he took a group of young people standing like that, and the blurriness of the face is original photo. It's not that I didn't do that blur, but actually from that photo I had the idea to use the blur effect for the film. Yeah.
Okay, great. I have one last question, and then we will move on to Haema. This question is about at the end of the film, you wrote like spiritually thank Gaston Bachela and Jacques Tournai. Yeah, who are those people and what did they inspire you?
So Jacques Tournai, yeah, he is the anthropologist who went to Vietnam during the colonial time, French. And then he's the expert on the Central Highlands with the indigenous people on the Central Highlands. And so there are the parts in the film about the tomb house, about the ritual, about the building tomb house for the dead people of the Yerai people, which I have to refer to his writing, for the for more how to say. I need some basic, scientific. No, it's not scientific anthropology. Nature, just information. Yeah. But actually, it's also inspired a lot of poetic image for me, like how he talked about the feeling and the crying of somebody to his death beloved one, and that's also the idea. Like I wanted to shoot the scene of people crying, something like that. Yeah. So to make the what he writes more visual and more poetic. Yeah. And for Gaston Bachelard, I think he's a French philosopher. So I was inspired by his book, the Poetics of Space. Yeah, which he writes about the house and every components of the house, and how they take a role in your memory, in our memory, like inside, outside, and like the corner of the room, and like the vertical of the house. What is the meaning of all of them? And I think very deeply that the treehouse theme is come from his writing. So it's overall is the poetic way approach of seeing house, seeing a home. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Haema, are you ready? I believe you have a presentation to show us.
Yes.
I'm sorry, keep going.
Sorry. I do have a presentation, so maybe I will show the slides and talk through the project, and I will talk a little bit about Francisco's film as well.
Yeah, great.
And then we can come back to, and if you don't mind, I'm going to take myself off video so that.
Yeah.
Okay. So. Screen. Give me a minute to. Okay, so hi everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. My name is Haema Sivanesan, as Kaifan's already mentioned. I'm a curator at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria, and I thought I'd begin by just indicating to you where I am. I'm on the west coast of Canada on Vancouver Island, and we typically introduce ourselves by way of a territory acknowledgement. So I'm on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen people of the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. So I want to acknowledge with respect the Indigenous peoples who are the traditional and ancestral custodians of this land and who continue to play an important role in the life and stewardship of the island. I'm going to begin with this map of the place where I live, as it may not be very familiar to you. I live in the city of Victoria, which is kind of at the bottom of the island here. It is the provincial capital of the state of British Columbia on the west coast of Canada. I'm about 2 hours by ferry, by sea, from Vancouver, which is on the mainland, and about 2 hours by ferry as well from Seattle to the south in the United States. So we're in a very interesting location, geographically, socially, in all kinds of ways. The island itself is about the size of Taiwan. So it's a very big island, but with a very small population of less than 1 million people. And about 20 to 25% of that population is Indigenous. So I'm taking a bit of time to explain this context to you because it's of specific relevance to some of what I want to talk about today. And it's a big part of the reason why I invited Francisco Herrera to show his film, Parallel Narratives, in Victoria. And I think most people would have had a chance to see this film online, hopefully over the last couple of days. The film was part of a group exhibition that I curated titled Imagining Fusang, Exploring Chinese and Indigenous Encounters. And it was a show that I curated for our museum in 2019, so this time last year. And the exhibition, along with Francisco's film, both deal with a number of issues that are the topic of the discussion today. So this idea of fiction and nonfiction was very much part of the discussion that we were having around that exhibition. And perhaps the common thread between Francisco's film and the exhibition that I curated and today's discussion as well has to do with storytelling and the ways in which stories, maybe rather than history, preserves culture and allows us to pass on cultural knowledge, especially from one generation to another, and becomes a way of connecting human beings across space and time and helping us to find ways to engage with each other and understand one another despite our differences. See if I can change the slide. So Parallel Narratives is a film that Francisco made in Hong Kong and Taiwan during a period between 2015 and 2017. And the film is structured as an essay film that draws on interviews and archival evidence, using what we might categorize as archaeological objects as evidence, and thinking of the museum as an archive of these types of objects. So the objects that he considers in his film raise many questions about the truth of history because they don't fit into the accepted narratives of history, and instead they suggest alternate truths. And in this way, Francisco's drawing on the ambiguous status of certain kinds of objects that you find in museums. And he's pointing to the instability of accepted history and showing us that history operates between this realm of fact and fiction. And maybe that it even finds its power in this sort of in-between or liminal realm. I'm going to try showing a video excerpt. Let's see if I can get it to work. So by pointing out the instability of accepted history, Francisco is interested in its philosophical or moral potential, and he's asking questions about its role or contribution to society. Who does history serve? What purpose does it serve? Is there a way that history can be more useful or productive and serve a more egalitarian social purpose? Which I think links us back to one of the core concepts of storytelling, being its moral value, teaching us how to live and how to prepare for the future, perhaps even showing us or teaching us how to create our future, and certainly to help us rethink our society in a more constructive way. So the story that Parallel Narratives tells us dates to ancient times and is the story of a place called Fusang. The narrator in the film says, in ancient times, Chinese sailors crossed the Pacific Ocean in search of what could be found on the other side. According to the legend, a Buddhist monk named Hui Shen, originally from Kabul, Afghanistan, along with 5 other Buddhist monks, are said to have traveled to lands in the most distant east beyond China and ostensibly to the west coast of the Americas during the reign of the Emperor Ming in the Southern Song dynasty. Hui Shen described his final destination as a place 20,000 Chinese li, which I believe is 8,000 or 9,000 kilometers east of China. And his account of these travels is to be found in the 7th century book of Liang. And the story eventually reached Europe in the 18th century, as we see from various examples of Venetian maps, some of which Francisco shows in his film. And this is an example of a map that we included in the exhibition. It is a map that's made by the Venetian map maker Antonio Zatta, and it dates to 1776. The map shows a colony, and I've pulled out a detail on the right hand of the slide. The map shows a colony named Fusang on the northwest coast of the Americas. This was one of the last maps, so it's actually here, and this is the detail that I've pulled out on the right-hand side. This is one of the last maps that depicted this idea of Fusang, and as you can see, it's a very elaborate map. It shows Asia on the left-hand side of the image and the Americas on the right-hand side of the image. At the top is the Arctic Circle. And as you move down this coastline of the Americas, you see sort of areas that could be, that we might understand now as Alaska, British Columbia, California, which is actually marked right down to the Baja Peninsula. And about midway along this coastline, whoops, I'll just go back. But midway along this coastline is a kind of island, which is in all probability Vancouver Island, where I am today, which is named on the map as the colony of Fusang. And the island is located between about 48 degrees to 52 or 51 degrees latitude, because the latitude lines are marked. And I'm sitting at about 48 degrees latitude right now, which is the southern end of Vancouver Island. So at the time that this Venetian map was made, the Europeans had still not arrived on the west coast of the Americas. So this was an imaginative map. It was a speculative map, a map that sort of archived a number of stories and narratives about places far away from Europe. And this map at the time also proposed a very different orientation to the world, in the sense that the Pacific Ocean was at the center of the map, which had still really not been navigated or charted. So this is a very different orientation to the world compared to the idea of the Atlantic Ocean, which was much more familiar to the Europeans. Other maps and other historians have suggested that Fusang was located further south in California or Mexico or in another part of South America. But for my purpose, this map and this version of history served my curatorial purpose, which was to kind of unsettle the accepted narratives about the history of this place and to allow for other voices and other perspectives to come into play in terms of the way that we make sense of the past and future of this place. And so now you can begin to see the connection that I was making between the place that I live in and the discussion that Francisco's film raises, because Francisco, although he's talking to some degree in sort of abstract about history and truth and fiction, it just took on another resonance on Vancouver Island, where the Indigenous people, as I mentioned before, are about 20 or 25% of the population. And they would certainly assert a very different view of history to the one that's made prevalent by the state, and one that would no doubt challenge the concepts of colonial discovery, which is sort of the very terms by which Canada as a nation state exists. So in order to bring forward some of these Indigenous narratives and perspectives, I invited an Indigenous elder and knowledge keeper named Hayups is his Indigenous name, and Ron Hamilton is his westernized name. I invited him to contribute to the exhibition. Hayups is an artist who has made an important contribution in the area of West Coast prints, Indigenous West Coast prints and printmaking, among his many other artistic and creative talents. And together we selected a number of screen prints that he had made. And these prints refer to Indigenous histories of sea travel, trade, cultural exchange. And what interested me about these prints were the stories that accompanied them. And this is a culture where the image stands in for a story. And Hayup's stories related a rich history of pre-colonial cosmopolitanism. And that was very much part of West Coast Indigenous culture and the spirit of what Francisco is also discussing in his film. So what you see here is a screen print of a welcome figure to suggest that the Indigenous people of the West Coast were traders. Even prior to European contact, Indigenous peoples welcomed visitors to their villages, and they themselves traveled across vast distances and had the courage and knowledge and technology to navigate the North Pacific Ocean. And more than that, they also had the social and diplomatic skills to arrive in foreign places and live among and alongside entirely different cultures and peoples. And this capacity for travel produced an intermingling of diverse peoples, experiences, ideas, technologies, worldviews, and so on. So one of the stories that Hayups shared with me, which I will share now, relates to the lives of his great-grandfathers, who between 1865 and 1910 regularly sailed to the Aleutian Islands and in the far North Pacific and into the Bering Sea. And then from there on to Japan in West Coast schooners, which are basically canoes. And they went hunting for seals. And Hayups discussed how his ancestors clearly had the knowledge and technology and the navigational skills to confidently navigate the ocean. And these men and the women who also sometimes traveled with them were invited to ceremonies and potlatches where they traded goods, as well as songs and stories. And Hayups gave me a specific example from his family of one of his great-grandfathers who traveled this way by schooner to Japan and took a Japanese wife with whom he had 2 sons. And so perhaps the relevance of this story here is to suggest that Hayup's great-grandfathers were clearly not the first to do this. The Indigenous people had long developed their seafaring skills, and they were very confident in navigating the ocean and traveling across the world in this way. And this is just to show you what one of the canoes looked like. It's a museum image, a sort of reconstructed image, but it gives you a sense of the kinds of technology that they were working with and the capacity that they had to work and travel in this way. A bit of a blurry image, but I'll go with it. This is just to give you a sense of what the exhibition looked like. And in the exhibition that I curated, the legend of Fusang provided a starting point for opening up a discussion about history. And I take the concept of Fusang as a kind of allegory or a critical device that allows us to consider other possibilities of history and to imagine stories that have been erased or denied or not even thought of for all kinds of social and political and methodological reasons. I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the other works that were included. A number of the works in the exhibition talked about a sort of post-contact or post-colonial history, if you like. But I was kind of really interested in the pre-contact histories, so the histories before European arrival, and to try to think about the impact of that, because there is so very little that we really know. This is a body of work produced by the Chinese-Canadian artist Gwenessa Lan. And I think her work was important because it contributes to this discussion. For the exhibition, Gwenessa set out to make a new body of work based on research that looked at the concept of Fusang from our West Coast Canadian perspective. And to do this, she undertook quite a lot of research, visiting museum collections, meeting with curators, collectors, and archaeologists, and then searching online for images and articles and even news reports. And in a similar way to Francisco, she was seeking out objects that disrupted the accepted narrative of history. So what you are looking at here is a photographic work by Gwenessa. It's a reversed or inverted photograph taken from a drawing that she made, which also forms part of the series of work. It has the title Saturna Island Ceramic Figure. And Saturna Island is a place, it's just a small island off the coast of this big island. So it's very nearby to us, and it's a place where this fragment of a head was found. And in the manner that Francisco discusses in his film, the Saturna head was one of those archaeological anomalies that scholars are unsure of what it is or where it came from, or even why it wound up on the Northwest Pacific coast, or indeed if it could be an object that is of indigenous origin. A number of scholars have speculated about the Asiatic features of this head, and particularly the top knot. And they've argued that this object may have come from Japan. And other scholars have argued that it's a fragment of an image of the sun god from New Mexico. But at this point in time, there's really very little that people know about this object. And what Gwenessa observed in the scholarship is that the idea of Fusang tends to come up in the context of this uncertainty. And Fusang kind of offers a possible solution, or actually maybe a kind of escape to the dilemma of history. For the exhibition, Gwenessa often worked with images that she found online. So in making this body of work, she's also thinking about how images and histories and their narratives or their commentaries circulate online and how they take on another register of meaning in that context, but also thinking about how these online discussions can skew or censor versions of history. And so she's asking all of these questions through the process of drawing. And these are two of the drawings that were included in the series. And I'll make the point that she makes the online source of her images evident in the way that she renders her drawings. So she's very careful to suggest the pixelated quality of the images that are her source material. So you get, I think you really get a sense of that. Even on the computer screen, you see how textured and pixelated the renderings are. In the exhibition, she presented her work as a cluster of images with specific images grouped together according to the narratives related to them. And here you see on the right-hand side, a Chinese coin, and on, sorry, that's on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, an indigenous stone lamp. And these were grouped together according to how they were found at an indigenous burial site in Alaska. So while the conventional historical narratives might explain to us what these objects are in the context of their specific cultures, when the two objects are found together, the meanings and their histories kind of become much less clear and maybe even confusing. So our capacity to know about the intersections of Chinese and West Coast indigenous cultures, and especially where it may date to pre-colonial times, is very fraught. It's an area of history that's largely dismissed for a range of methodological and political reasons. And it becomes a kind of unspeakable history because it challenges the status quo. And so here you see how she's reversed the drawing of the coin into a photograph. And just to say that in our context on Vancouver Island, and this is, I'm sure it's very true in many other contexts as well, this way of approaching history by leaving out or dismissing the anomalies of history or marginalizing certain cultural perspectives kind of goes hand in hand with the need to exert authority. So history becomes a political tool and a kind of rhetorical tool, which is a means to an end. So perhaps it's not as neutral or impartial as it may claim to be. And I think this is a point that Francisco makes very much in his film by trying to shift from history to a more speculative fictional narrative. But I think what these artists have done by identifying the instability or ambiguity of history and its artifacts is to evoke the aesthetic potential, to evoke kind of the poetic or the aesthetic potential of storytelling and of these histories, which then enable us to connect with the objects and connect with each other culturally in a new way. So this way of making history, humanizing history perhaps, and finding ways to bridge cultural differences, and in that way sort of finding a way to accept a multiplicity of pasts and possible futures. And certainly I think Francisco's film begins to kind of suggest a path for enabling us to do some of that work. So I think I'll leave it at that, and we can go to some questions or discussion. So back on video.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. You've
Yeah.
just like perfectly summary what I want to say with this topic. Especially, you know, what you said by the end of your presentation, you know, like history is not as impartial and as evidential as it looks like. It is a way of assert, you know, certain authority by, you know, hegemonic or dominant worldview. And then, you know, by, you know, employing aesthetic potential in art forms and stuff, we can just, like, as you said, humanizing history. That's a very great way to put it. So yeah, I have prepared some questions, and so let's go on and talk about that. And then after about an hour or so, we will open up the floor to our audience. So first of all, let's go back to Wei's film, and I really want to talk more about the Mars and the future, and you know, the scientific well, science fiction elements in your film. You know, you position yourself, the narrator or the filmmaker, on a distant planet in a distant future, and you like, there are, I remember, 2 phone calls maybe, you know, to your dad, and from a very distant place, and we can hear that it's a recording of a telephone, you know, and his recording is not as clear as your voice, but you don't offer, you know, any much information or any visualization of Mars, but you just mentioned like there is sound about it, which I do appreciate. But you, like, with the depiction of Mars, you mentioned that there is, you know, it's more in comparison or in contrast with your experience on Earth. You miss the wind, you miss the noise, but there is nothing, you know, like wind or noise on, you know, in the life on Mars. And so I think, in my opinion, like the Mars in the future becomes this, you know, unknown, uncertain void in the film. And it's, as a point of reference, it's very hard for our audience to identify what your position is, and to imagine that, you know, where you are, you have this sense of, you know, ambiguity and also distance, but it's very hard to identify. So could you tell us a little bit more about why you include this element and how it works with other narratives? And also, you've mentioned that you made other short films. One of them is called Mars in the Well, and it's also about Mars and also a space migrant plan. So can you tell us a bit more about, you know, this constant presence of Mars as a sort of an element in your work, and how is that related to some of the maybe historical and social issues that you want to address about Vietnam?
Yes. So the idea of Mars, I think it goes back to 2014 when I was making a short film you just mentioned, Mars in the Well. So during that time, I remember we were talking about a statement from the head of the Communist Party. So he says something like, even himself, he cannot know in 100 years Vietnam can reach its goal of socialism. And so we was very amazed by that confession that he would not know how and when the country will lead to in 1 century, which is very bad, you know. So the idea of that kind of utopia and that kind of ideology, and it matched also with another very popular news during that time about the plan to bring people to Mars. So during, I think, like in 2014, it's somehow it started the news that everyone talking about, like if they pay for you, will you go to Mars to live, you know, and something like that. And by some connection, I see the connected point of the statement of the head of the country and the idea and the story of bringing people to Mars. And so for me, Mars is somehow, and Also another reason why I use Mars is because it's kind of the counterpoint for Vietnam, because scientifically Vietnam will be one of the most damaged country if there is global warming, you know, when the sea level are rising up. So like Saigon, most of Saigon will be underwater. So yeah, so millions of people will have to move house. And combine everything together, real and fiction and political and imagination. Something I come up with the idea for that short film is that a young man played by me have to go to Mars, and he was lost there because obviously it's Mars, so you don't know. And then he called to his father, and then the film go back to the kind of the memories or the fiction or the imagination of him about life on Earth with his father or something like that. And so I continue that in the tree house, but the idea of Mars didn't appear in the film at the beginning, and also not during the editing. It only appeared at the end of the editing after almost 1 year of editing. So because for me at the beginning I wanted to make the treehouse somehow traditional documentary, you know, with more or less direct approach, but then it doesn't work. It lacks something, and then after about 1 year of editing, I started to make some change, and then it comes to the point that Mars appear again, and this time Mars is also a counterpoint of Earth, of Vietnam, and you mentioned about the distance and something about unknown, you know, and I think it's perfectly that's what to create a film, because in order to understand about here we need to be there, you know, we need to feel the distance. So Mars is a perfect example for that, because it can be real, even though it will not be in short time, but it will be real, you know. Who know, one day we will go to Mars. It's possible. And also I didn't want to show any science fiction movie like image, you know. Like when we talk about future in cinema, automatically we have the image of more or less a Hollywood movie, you know, with kind of robot and then the mechanic world, something like that. But the question is actually we don't know anything about future, you know. It's just more or less the imagination based on what is now, you know. And if you imagine that now a car go on the road, so you think in the future the car will fly. So, but it's of course it's possible, but it's nobody see future yet, and that's a perfect excuse for doing whatever you want with the future idea. You don't need to follow the Hollywood kind of future, which is become more mainstream now. So future is become, for me, it become like kind of blank screen, you know, that you can put anything there, but you don't need to explain, and most important, you don't need to put anything there, you know, because it's like that. It's a question, it's a blank space, and it's place for more for imagination than more for visualization. It's something like that. Yes, I think, yeah.
Yeah, I really like.
Could I say something about that, Kaifan? Because I found that there was this really interesting connection between Hui's idea of Mars and the way that he's using it as a conceptual device in the film, and then Francisco's concept of the zenith, which becomes this sort of methodological device for getting distance on the, you know, the questions and the ideas that he's exploring. And for me, I was also wondering about, because there's a way in which Mars helps you almost identify with the displacement of the indigenous people. And so I thought it was a really interesting way to make the viewer kind of relate, you know, help them relate to the subjects of your documentary.
Yeah. So I think you remind very important point also among us is about the displacement. So I think basically we all have to display some at some point of our life, you know. We move place to live, we move from here to there, and it will be okay if the displacement, you can say, is from our free will, you know, it's from our choice. But at the same time, there is another kind of displacement that's not from the choice of people. And in this case, in the film, is the indigenous people that they was forced to move, not because they want, but because of the policy, because of the idea of some other people who have the right, have more power to do that. And like in my film, I talk about the statement of a soldier. He a very normal soldier, you know, the border police. So he says something to me that very at the same time very amazed, but very shocking, because how naive, you know, in the way of even just a small simple soldier. He told me like about the displacement of the root people. He said that we were standing in front of the rice paddy field, and then there are some people who working on the field, which are root people, because the root people they don't cultivate, they live in the cave, you know. So their habit is more like hunting and collecting, and they live on the forest. They don't cultivate rice. Of course, you cannot cultivate rice in the forest, on the mountain. But after bringing back the root people to the resettlement village, the authorities start to teach them how to cultivate rice, and then in front of the station of the border police, there is a very small field. It's kind of like a school, you know, a school, that a training place for the people to grow rice. And then that soldier pointing his finger to the people who working on the field, and told me that teaching the people how to cultivate rice is help them to evolve 1,000 years faster. He say that very sharply and very proudly and very naively. And yeah, so in the film we see Mars is something like the destined future, that we all have to move somewhere, but at the same time it's the forced displacement. And but the question for me is like Miss Ho, the pupils, the main character of the film. She was forced to move out of the cave when she was just 11 years old. And now she's more than 65 something years old. So more than 50 years living in this society, you know, and she speaks very well Vietnamese language. And so I feel that they kind of dilemma for me. I don't know if it's for her, but I think that I cannot how to say sentimentalize, you know, like the life in cave and is better and is more original, and you should go back to cave to live. You shouldn't live in the village built by the government. And I think because now for her it's a whole of network and relationship with her husband, with her children, with her it's there. It's in the place that at the first point she didn't want to go, but now it's become her house, it become her home, and with all of the relationship. So now even for her, I feel, and I think probably she cannot go back to the cave to live, even she still visit that 1 or 2 per year just for her emotion. I think for kind of emotion, homesick, you can say that, but to live there and to live there happily and healthily, she cannot. So I avoid it in the film, that the way that I don't want to romanticizing the modern life and the original way of living. Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Before I comment on what you just said, I want to mention that I just noticed that we have more than 80 people in the Himalaya Live. So I think because this Zoom session, I think we can maximum have 50 people. So the majority of people are on another platform. And I'm really impressed by what you guys has just said. I sense that there is a I don't know, a contrast or a contradiction between, you know, what like in Haema's exhibition and in the treehouse. Like I remember in Haema's exhibition, and also what you wrote for, well, it's not an article, but a conversation transcript you sent me in the Journal of Contemporary Chinese Art, that one. And in the introduction of that conversation, you mentioned the capacity for travel. And also you just, you know, during your presentation, you talk about how the ability to travel, both for a non-Western civilization like China and for indigenous community, and how that empower, you know, say like the non-Western community to interpret and to reimagine their own history. But on the other hand, in the treehouse, and also I think the same problem happened with a lot of indigenous community in the Americas, is that, you know, the hegemonic, I don't know, authority or the European way of thinking is to impose progression and impose travel on the indigenous community. You see, you know, even though it's the same case with, you know, travel geographically or temporally or historically, there is a difference between, you know, people forcing you to do that and how that, you know, grab your power away and make you something like you are so backward and you have to evolve. But that's not the same thing as the capacity for travel that you mentioned in Imagining Busan. So yeah, I think there is this certain link between how we can reframe you know, different travel over history and over geographical locations, and how those narratives play a part in how we, you know, interpret or yeah, reimagine history. And yeah, I think this links back to my question to both of you. I think you both talk about it in your presentation and just then, is that, you know, this temporal spatial range that these narrative, this ambiguous or this fictional elements that's in your work, and how it creates the temporal spatial range that we can, you know, in which we imagine our history. It's different from what the Western worldview or the Western way of historiography as a sort of foreclosed, you know, different, you know, indigenous community or different civilization or different history in a very limited space and time. And, you know, how people imagine indigenous community is always in the past, or it's always on certain locations, but by creating or by taking advantage of certain ambiguity in historical data or in the future, you kind of expand that temporal spatial range. And I don't know what you guys think about this, but I find that, you know, it has a great potential in how we talk about history.
I think it's I like the way you're describing it as this temporal spatial wrench, because it's true, there is kind of a very significant gap in knowledge then. And it can be a very, very fruitful place. It's interesting with Hui's film because I think the woman that you interviewed, the Rook woman, maybe she's the first generation to be displaced, whereas in Canada, the Indigenous artists that I have been working with are probably fourth, fifth generation displaced. And of course, it's been a violent history, a very traumatic history. But now we are living at a time where there is a lot more scope to perhaps rethink, for Indigenous people even, to rethink and question those histories and narratives that have been imposed on them. And they certainly do feel displaced, but now are able to reclaim some of almost the nostalgia that you speak about in your film, Hui. They can go back into those spaces in the way that the Rook woman goes back to the cave and spends, you know, a night or 2 nights with her family in the cave. Indigenous people here are doing that too, as a way of keeping that knowledge and keeping a hold on that way of living. And I think there's also belief here among the Indigenous people that when climate change hits, because they have that knowledge, they will be able to survive. And so I think that, I think actually that's really important. I think that way of being able to go back into those spaces, geographic as well as temporal spaces, and reclaim ways of living is important for the future that is unknown. Space that we don't know what it is going to be.
I totally agree, because it's very beautiful how the Rook people they still go back to their cave, you know, just for short days during the year. And I think in that way it's somehow it's about memory, it's like homesick, but also, yeah, like you said, also the Miss Housey, she also wanted to take her grandchildren or her children to go with her to the cave. Yeah, it's also kind of to just basically just to let them know where their mother, where their grandmother was born and come from, something like that. Yeah.
There's a sequence in your film where you show, I mean, she talks a lot about the food that they ate and how they gathered different plants and berries and things like that. And even here, there's a lot of revival of that kind of knowledge, Indigenous plants and medicine. As a form of knowledge that doesn't fit into the Western framework, but is being reclaimed as a form of Indigenous knowledge. I don't know if that's true in Vietnam as well.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because Miss Ho, she the expert of the Rook people traditional herbal medicine. So she worked with I think the local authority to categorize the medicines, the herbal medicine that can be used. And you also mentioned about food, and for me it's very interesting because in the film like she keep telling about food, you know, it's like something that's so strong. And she talk about monkey meat, you know, because for them monkey meat is something like chicken meat for us, I guess. And so it brought me to a very interesting question during the shooting, like should I let them hunt a monkey and eat? You know, because that's the thing, because now to hunt a monkey in that forest is illegal. And now to eat monkey is it's kind of too violent for most of the people. So it's very interesting the way we see different perspective for the same thing. Because for us to eat monkey is totally brutal and illegal, but for them to eat monkey is normal and is full of memory, home memory. Yeah.
It's similar to the indigenous communities here who were whalers and hunting whales, and whale meat is a staple for those communities, but of course it's illegal. I think some communities are now trying to negotiate with governments to be allowed to hunt.
Yeah.
Some hunting that's allowed, but again, it becomes like a process of then reviving those skills and the knowledge to know how to do it, because it's a very dangerous thing to do as well. Yeah.
I think that's very relevant, especially during, the COVID-19 era, the stigmatization of food, of eating, and what is considered proper to be eaten by, certain, especially this is only a problem to, I guess, non-European peoples, because there is a standard of what is proper food and what is not. And I guess this is very relevant. And also what Haema just said reminds me of, if you're interested, I will find it for you later. I don't remember the name, but there is a YouTube channel, an indigenous young lady. She she lives in this very modern house, but she posts cooking videos of how to cook with indigenous ingredients. So yeah, that's another way of, like this inheritance of indigenous knowledge. And also both of your work mentioned like consulting an indigenous elder and the kind of, passing on of certain knowledge. I think it's very important. And I really appreciate what you, before your presentation, you acknowledge the land you're on and the indigenous. I think because this is something that's very particular, I guess, in the Americas. Even in New York, we do that sometime, but in other parts of the world, it's something that's unfamiliar to them. And I want to move on to another question, which is about the media, or certain ways of, capturing memory or ways of reflecting or representing history that's that appears in both of your work. I remember in Wiz Film, you have this doodling or drawing of small houses, pencil on paper. And you also talk a lot about the materiality of film, the negative, and the how it's related to the realm of the living and the realm of the dead. So I think it's very interesting. And why, can you tell us a little bit more about why you choose to incorporate drawing in your film and how that's related to the physicality of image? And also your point about, the vulnerability of our imaging memory and how our memories depend on image. And we are just unable to remember things if there is no image. Whereas, the Rook lady, she can recall things. And then there's, another question will be about storytelling, but that's another topic. Can you talk more about the drawings first?
Well, the drawing, I think, like for the house on mountain, that I saw a long time ago how to visualize that, and it's come to the point using hand drawing, which is very basic. But I think like at the end of the tree house, you will see like the camera moving in the dark cave, and then with a lot of drawings. I think it's a drawing of the people. They went to the cave, mostly children or young people, just for fun, and then they draw a lot of things on the cave, like the numbers, like aliens, everything. And then at one point I saw on the wall of the cave there is the drawing of a house that more or less look exactly like my hand drawing of the house that I remember. So I think if I ask you or Haema or everyone to draw a house, we will draw more or less the same house, with a roof like that.
Yeah.
I don't know, but it's at the same time it's abstract, but it's very connected because we have the same kind of imagination and remembering about something, especially a house. It has to be like that. So when children draw a house, they draw all the same, exactly the same way of house, you know, with the roof like mountain. And for me, I think drawing is of course it also relates to your question about media and the media capturing memory. So now we have film and we have photography, and then we keep going backward like that in time. We will stop in the point that they drawing in the cave of the primitive people is obviously, yeah, it's how they show what they saw, you know, like during the hunting or something like that. But for me, drawing is different from photography because it's very abstract and it's personal, but it's abstract and it's not correct, you know, because it's not information, it's something about emotion, drawing. And because it's different from like when we take photograph, the labor that we take to take a photograph, especially now, it's so small. But if we want to draw something that we remember, it takes a lot of effort, and so it talks something about emotion for me. That when you try to draw something, that's you try to remember, and interestingly, that you remember will not be well, and you will keep add on your imagination, you know, and it's keep evolving like that. So that's why in the film I use drawing, because to show the house that I remember, which I'm sure is not correct. It's just a very abstract house like that. But also in the relation to another medium in the film, like photograph, the archival photograph of the people, the illegal migrated people in Cambodia, whose face are blurred, and also the medium of film itself, that the film itself, and also the archival footage of the American soldier. So like yes, and also the medium of storytelling that come from the indigenous people. Like by how they crying, and by crying, like for the Yarai people, when they visit the tomb house, they go inside a very small house, and then they sit inside and they crying, and that crying is like telling a story about the relationship with the dead mother and the family and the working equipment, you know. So it tell a lot of things, and especially for Miss Ho, how she tell everything when she was just born, you know. She remember exactly where she was just born and what she did when she was 2 years old. And every time she told me it's a bit different, more or less, you know. But that's the interesting point, because it's really about imagination, I think. Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, Kaifan, can I say something about something you said about how, or maybe Hui said it, about if there is no image, there is no memory. And it seems to be so very true when history is so constructed by these sort of very empirical terms or framework. And we see that definitely here, and I'm sure in Vietnam as well, where if there is no image, it's like there's no evidence. And so it's interesting. I found the sequence where the Rook woman talks about her birth, and you question it. You say in the film how you yourself are asking questions about whether this could be real, because how do you remember your own birth? And I just found that fascinating, because it also talks about how we no longer really value those oral traditions, those oral cultures in the same way anymore, because, you know, they are just sort of dismissed as stories. But within it, actually, more often than not, is the truth that's kind of embedded in the truth. And maybe the details change a little bit, but actually there's an essence of truth in the story, in the fiction.
Yeah, of course. I think there is the similarity between, the storytelling in the treehouse and the storytelling in imagining Busan. I think it's basically the same thing, whereas one is on the private, the personal level, whereas the other is on, the community or national level. Sometimes we will think that there is this absolute authority of one certain truth, and then stories that have slight difference in them, or oral traditions, or non-photographic or written evidence will be dismissed because they are not consistent throughout history. But I think there is like a certain similarity in that, like how we imagine history would be like is the same as how we imagine our own birth is like. And yeah, I think even though from like a more modern or Western perspective, you're impossible to remember your own birth, and if your memory changes all the time, that's a wrong memory. But I think with storytelling there is a different significance in this evolving and changing stories, and I think there is value in that, and I think there is a similarity in both of your work. Yeah, and I think we still have like 15 minutes before we move on to a Q&A. I will keep asking questions, so we can, before moving on to the medium, do you have anything to say, Haema, about the different media involved in the exhibition you curated, like the prints, the photographs, and the drawings, and also there's several videos I remember. How do you envision them working together, and is there anything you want to add to different media and different ways of storytelling?
I think the reason for incorporating different media, I mean, there are a few different reasons, partly because I was including work by artists who had a affinity or something to contribute to the discussion on this subject. And so, of course, then you're inviting them to participate in the medium that's natural to them. So I had Francisco's film, of course, and then artists working in drawing, photography, printmaking, painting, and there was some video work as well. And really it was just that was the natural media in which each of those artists worked and wanted to work, and that was the context in which their imaginations functioned appropriately, I guess. But I'm also, as a curator, always thinking about the exhibition experience and what is that for the visitor going into the gallery, and trying to create a variety so that the experience becomes richer. And what I found was that there's work some work is more literal than other work. And then we had a video piece which was very much based in oral history, like contemporary oral histories. And then Gwenessa's work, which is quite conceptual. And then the relationship between all of these different approaches helps the viewer to kind of go into the subject matter a little bit more deeply, and to find a starting point, because I think everybody has a different starting point. And sometimes the more literal sort of oral histories are easier for a general audience that might be new to many of these discussions. So it offers an entry point that's easy, but also immediately gets their attention. So yeah, that's kind of the way in which it grew. And I really didn't have anything much to do with sort of determining that this person should make a film or that person should make a painting. It was really more about approaching artists who had an idea to contribute to the discussion.
I think that's like what you just said about creating a accessible and comfortable exhibition experience for audience. It's like a perfect transition to my next question. because during my research of your work, I found the recording of your talk at the SASI annual symposium. And also you wrote a short essay called What is Critical Curating in the Canadian Art Review. And in both, you mentioned this notion of care in curatorial practice. You know, for instance, you said like there is radicality in caring for one's non-Western culture and also caring for issues of identity, representation, race, and coloniality. So I'm sorry, that's a very difficult word to pronounce. So yeah, can you talk a little bit more about, you know, this curatorial rationale, you know, the notion of caring in your, not just in, you know, caring for the audience, but caring for, you know, different cultures and different worldviews and different ways of interpreting history and different art forms, I guess.
I think it comes about because working in museum spaces can be, there's such a great deal of pressure to conform to a set way of thinking, whether that comes out of ethnography or art history or even critical, you know, critical theory. And I feel like over the years of doing this kind of curatorial work, there needed to be ways in which other cultural perspectives could assert themselves in those environments. Otherwise, you are expected to conform. And that's a kind of very difficult thing to do because in many ways, we all live in a diaspora setting and there are many, many ways in which we have to fit into the dominant culture that we are living within, but there's always going to be the need to hold on to the cultures that you are from. So it's always this tension that you're working with, and I don't know what it's like in the filmmaking world, but you've already talked about, way about countering the Hollywood narrative and the expectation to work in film in a certain way, which can be very expensive. And so how do we create those spaces of resistance? Because if we can open up those spaces, then I think many, many more people can participate. That's one thing. But one of the things that I found with Imagining Fusang and with some of the other shows that I've done is that it opens up completely new areas of, you know, a very local history. People had never thought of. It had just never occurred to them because, for one, the images don't exist, but also for a mainstream public, there's no reason to think about these questions because, well, because they've absorbed kind of the accepted history. And so to challenge those ideas, I think, is really important because it opens up the discussion and allows for more of us to participate in the discussion.
Wait, do you have anything to add? If not, I think it's very relevant.
You're muted.
Oh, you mute yourself? Did you mute yourself? Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is also very relevant what you just said about the question or, you know, this daily experience of diasporic, you know, living a diasporic life. And I believe both of you and also as well as myself, we're, you know, at the moment living a diasporic life and, you know, working in an environment that's kind of different from where we come from, but also that because of this constant diasporic experience, I was very touched by what Wei has said in his film. You know, when you mentioned this this song by this female singer who was who used to be very famous, and you know, by introducing her song, you said nostalgia is to return home with pain, and you know, that sentence moved me immensely because I think for people who are living in a diasporic experience, and that's something that's constantly on our mind. And this notion of returning home kind of becomes something abstract. It's not just we buy a flight ticket and go somewhere, but it's kind of embedded in our own journey, and also our daily and artistic or scholarly practice. And I think this is probably my final question about the in both of your work you talk about home and homelessness, or making home, building a home, or leaving a home. So there is like this constant cloud of notion around home. And I wonder, and that's something that's probably defined, because I know that in our audience we have a lot of young artists and scholars from China, but probably living elsewhere in the world right now. And I think that's something that also defines our own experience. And so yeah, I think this is the last question, is to sort of move slightly away from the aesthetic world or the art world and move into the more private realm. And I want to ask, like, what do you say is the relation between your creative methods and your self-exploration of self-representation? Because I believe in both of your work there is a very I guess a presence of self in them. It's not only about talking about other indigenous community. And I think how does this way of working help you making sense of your own experience and diasporic feelings? And I guess, yeah, I think for all of us, there's this constant question of like, how do our own diasporic experience place us in relation to these histories of different parts of the world, not only where you come from, but also where you live and where you have traveled. And also, histories of displacement, of migration. And sometimes, with talking about diaspora and migration, there is this victim narrative, or this sense of vulnerability, which I think is definitely there. But I also think there is potential in the way we imagine the world that is different from a non-diasporic experience, I guess.
Wei, I think you should start.
So it's more about okay, I think how to say. So I think, yeah, you mentioned about nostalgia and returning home and diasporic experience. So I think what make how to say the diasporic life different and difficult is because you cannot be there, to witness the changes, and it make that you're afraid to go back because you're afraid to face the change of the people, of the family, of the landscape. And so I think even for me now, even for me, like, I still keep the same image of my hometown or my family, exactly the same, even though I know that they are going to change. For example, the neighborhood of my family, they are going to be demolished and they have to move to another area, but also the same city. But for me, somehow that idea to go back at this time and to witness that is a bit too much. So I decided that I will not go back at the time, and because you don't have time to see the change growing, and you only came after the aftermath of what already happened. So I think that make the going back home a difficult choice for me. And I think including the tree house and the other film too is kind of the documentary capture of the life in my hometown and the life of my family, and especially the appearance of my parents in the film. So for me, all of the film that I make deeply is the documentary for me. even though there are masks, there are fictional, blah blah blah, but because the people are real, and then they play themselves, and the house is real, and the connection, the relation between you and the people and the location is real, you know. It cannot be fiction. So in the deep sense, for me, they are all documentary, and in that sense, my films they capture what I knew that would happen, the change would happen, because the plan to move for my family and for the neighborhood is already settled like 20 years, 10 years ago, you know. So I knew that that the change will come. So maybe that a sense of fear of that why I made film with my parents and in my hometown to documenting, yeah, all of that. And now next year I'm sure nothing will be left, you know, everything will be changed. And so approach from the future perspective, that I really feel that all of my film they already become documentary. Yeah, in the sense that they capture, yeah. Yes.
I was going to ask if there was a sense of biography or autobiography across all of your films because of the way you insert yourself into.
Yeah, I think it's that is very clear. Yeah, it's the biography. Yeah, but because I use the fiction element, you mentioned about Kaifan, about the fiction element. It's biography, but I combine with fiction elements just because I don't want it to be too much emotional. You know, it's the excuse to be emotional without being emotional. Yeah, to use the fictional elements in the biographical film. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, and actually now living here in Europe, I feel that like I'm living on Mars, basically, because the south here, like it's more quiet than in Vietnam. You know, than Vietnam, we always have motorbike, and the street outside is so noisy. So sometimes here at night it's so quiet, and I feel like I am living the experience that I made in the films. So, which I don't like, because I want to really detach of the real experience with the fictional experience, but sometimes they meet. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that point that you make about not, you know, putting yourself in the films, but also not wanting it to be too emotional, and therefore this point about vulnerability is kind of an interesting one, because I think what I try to do in the work that I do is to also kind of begin from that place. I'm fourth generation in the diaspora, and I feel like every generation of my family before me has moved continents and had to make all of these cultural adjustments, all kinds of adjustments that you have to make when people immigrate. So I think that's a kind of very deep place of knowing to sort of begin from in doing any kind of creative work, I think. So if you can draw on that vulnerability in a productive way, I think that's where we're then able to bring in a different perspective to what we would otherwise see in the dominant culture. And for me, I think I've begun to really understand that home is a very contingent idea. It's a very unstable and contingent idea. Maybe I've given up. So one of the things I'm quite interested in is this sense of unhomeliness, and what does that, because that's what I immediately register, like immediately register how everything is always unfamiliar and uncomfortable and homely. And so I think a lot of the work that I've been doing on Vancouver Island since I've been here for 5 years is to think about place actually, as a kind of very abstract question. Like in some parts it's about where am I? But really going deep into that question of where am I, and how do all of the different kinds of people that live here understand that concept of where they are, which is kind of what you're also doing in your film, I think, Hui, by going to all of these Indigenous people and asking them about home. It's asking a similar kind of question about how do they conceive of this place and what matters to them. So I think in terms of what I'm doing here now, I think that's kind of the thread through most of my work for now.
I think it's I think what Kui just said about, you know, living in Europe now feels like living on Mars. That's extremely relevant to our current, you know, quarantine status right now, because, you know, wherever you are on Earth, you just feel like you're living in a, I don't know, like a spaceship or something, that you're isolated from other people. And then you also don't feel related to the city or the neighborhood that you live in at the moment, because of, you know, you are unable to go out and, you know, to have you know, real, like a physical connection with the ground that you are on. So I guess there is an element of yeah, like what people has been saying recently about this, you know, foreign or strange state of living that people are experiencing now at this moment. And then also I think what is also very relevant in Kui's film about the idea of home, and how, you know, one space can be home, can be a private space for somebody, while it can be a public, or it can be, you know, a different, like a space for a different function for other people. I remember that you have footages of caves for tourism, like there are tourists in those caves, whereas cave, you know, for the rock people, that's their home and that's their private space and where they, you know, sleep. But for other people, that's a public space for tourism. And I think this notion of transforming or defamiliarizing a certain physical space is also true to us right now, because if you are locked in your home for a long period of time, and at some point it doesn't feel like a safe and comfortable space anymore, it kind of feels like something strange, or something some space that function as a confinement rather than a space of safety. Yeah, I think everything is just so related. Yeah, I think I don't have well, I have one more question, and I will see if our audience have any question for you. So before we move on, can I ask you guys, if you are able to disclose that to me, what are you working on right now? Is that a secret?
Haema, can you first?
What?
You know what? Because of this pandemic, everything has been down.
Yeah.
So all the projects that I thought I was going to be working on, especially as a curator, because we're working with artists and all kinds of people inside and outside the institution, a lot of things are a bit upside down because we don't really know what's happening going forward. Some of my projects have gone online. So we're trying to see how to use different kinds of online formats to at least keep going forward with research, but also thinking about how online formats might allow us to show certain kinds of work. So I am continuing to work with Indigenous communities on Vancouver Island. So I'm working with a colleague on the other side of the country in Montreal. And we're working on a project with an Indigenous community about 2 hours north from here, and we're actually talking about home.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually very interesting. And I think we're just at the early stages of that, where we have to go through lots of ethics protocols because we have research funding for that. But I'm actually very excited about doing that work, but also bringing that online, because I think it creates a new context for that. So I'm going to be interested to see how that goes. But that's the only really firm thing right now. I'm working on a lot of exhibition publications and books and things like that. But this project with the Indigenous community is one that's kind of probably very exciting because it's new. Yeah.
Yes, and for me, for this year, I will make one short film for the studio in France. It's a very short film, and this time I want to experiment on the analog, So this film will be shot on 60mm and will be edited totally analog. And that's a new experiment for me on the medium and the way of editing. And but yeah, of course, during this time I have to wait. I cannot shoot because the film involved in the actors. They are quite old, like more than 60 years old. So it's more. We have to be more careful. And so we have to wait and to ask for the authorization, which is not that clear yet, that when we can shoot. And the funny thing is that because the film title is the people who wait, that's the title of the film. So now more and more I feel like it's like a curse now that now I keep waiting, so I should change the title.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I think a lot of plans have been disrupted right now, but I also see a lot of potential in the way things work right now. Because I think normally, like with conversation, we do things in physical space, and that means that there are a limited, number of people that we can incorporate in the same space, and also the guest speakers, because we don't have budget to fly people around, so they have to be either in Beijing or in New York City to do that. But now we have this global conversation. My colleague just told me that we are running out of time. It's over 2 hours right now. So yeah, I think do you guys have any last things to say before we come to an
end? I think like what you just said about the Zoom meeting actually is I really like.
Did you enjoy your first one?
It's getting more enjoyable now.
Well, yes. People have been saying that people get Zoom fatigue right now, so we shouldn't do too long. It's already more than 2 hours. You're right. So you just said, yeah.
This way is for for Vietnamese art scene in Vietnam. I think it's helpful. Even for China, I think we are the same, more or less the same situation, because to organize this kind of how to say in-person meeting like this, it's not easy, and sometimes we have problems. Yeah, we know what, and so but honestly, I still prefer meeting in person. Yeah.
Well, I really enjoyed being able to do this. I really admire how you've been able to coordinate all of us across so many different time zones. That's really ambitious and quite something, because I wouldn't have had the chance to meet both of you otherwise. So.
I felt like people in China are falling asleep right now.
Yeah, probably.
But thank you for joining us, and thank you for talking at length about your work. I feel like we had a great conversation, and it's very helpful to say how we think about, you know, how we do our own work, and also think about the time we're in right now. So
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, if we don't have anything else, feel free to leave the meeting.
Yeah, maybe like we can remind people that the film, The Treehouse and the Parallel Narrative, they will still be on Catholic Play for one more day. So if any of you haven't seen the film, like those are two really great films, and go check it out. And we will release like one or two films like every 2 weeks. So just stay in contact with us and keep checking those updates.
Yeah, we will also send out the transcript of this conversation later. So if anybody wants any reference, we can do that as well.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks,
Great.
everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.